On the 14th of May 2022, 11-year-old Wilmer L. disappeared on his way from the school garden in the town of Storfosse. A bicycle left near a forest path and a phone forgotten at home turned out to be the first strange signs in a case full of contradictions and mysterious clues. For a whole year, the case remained cold until the police stumbled upon a discovery that changed everything. A cage, toys, and the boy's words, "I am Wilmer." It was a typical Saturday in a small town. The streets were practically empty. Rare passers-by were occupied with everyday concerns. No one expected incidents, and nothing indicated that this day would become the starting point of one of the strangest cases in the region's history. 11-year-old Wilmer L. left the school garden around 5 in the evening. The way home always took exactly 13 minutes. A small road, a couple of turns, a path by the forest area. His parents had long stopped worrying since he always returned on time. But not this time. In the evening, the boy's bicycle was found near the forest path, neatly leaned against a tree. There were no traces of struggle, scattered belongings, or signs of urgent departure. The bicycle stood as if Wilmer intended to return in a minute or two, but something suddenly changed his plans. The mobile phone remained at home charging, and this deprived the possibility of tracking his movements. The local police arrived at the call around 8 in the evening. More than 3 hours had already passed since the disappearance. In the first hours of the search, an alarm was raised throughout the entire commune. Volunteers, rescuers, and local residents quickly gathered at the scene. But hours passed, and there was no result. And yet, no traces or any evidence except this strange, lonely standing bicycle was found. Official representatives commented dryly the next day, "We cannot assert anything concrete yet. We continue searching." But these words sounded like a formality since in practice no one had the slightest idea where Wilmer could have disappeared. The first few days gave small clues which, however, could not explain the disappearance. First, near the bicycle, they found no traces of conflict. The ground was not disturbed. The grass was not trampled. Experts noted that if something happened suddenly, it was done so carefully that no physical evidence remained at all. Second, in the boy's personal belongings, they found a diary. This was an ordinary notebook, filled mainly with notes about school, games, and walks. However, the police's attention was drawn to the last page. There was written literally the following: "Run to another place." This phrase looked random, written hastily, but it was precisely this that caused the first assumptions about a possible voluntary departure. Third, among the locals, rumors quickly spread that Wilmer was allegedly seen a few days before the disappearance in the company of a man whom the locals simply called the Forester. This was an unofficial character whom no one personally knew, but whom everyone somehow heard about. There was no concrete data about him since this was a typical urban myth. However, the police were forced to deal with this version as well. Soon the police received the first directions for investigation. Wilmer's classmates remembered that shortly before the incident he had a conflict with a boy named Kevin. The conflict was insignificant, standard school quarrels, but with a disappearance, any detail was given special weight. The police questioned Kevin, however he only confusedly stated that he had not seen Wilmer for several days and knew nothing. Another suspect became an unemployed neighbor named Holger. This man was known for collecting weapons and had repeatedly attracted police attention. His house was searched. He was questioned several times, but no evidence against him was found. Suspicions melted away, but an unpleasant residue remained since there were too many coincidences not to check everything thoroughly. The police took the version with Kevin seriously, since soon after the disappearance it turned out that the boy had also disappeared from home for 24 hours. Kevin's parents could not explain where he was during this time, and the police decided that this could not be a coincidence. But careful checking of surveillance cameras at the local station shops and roads showed that Kevin simply ran away from his parents for a day, wandered around the city, and clearly did not participate in anything criminal. This turned out to be the first false lead, which nevertheless temporarily distracted police attention from other possible directions of investigation. For almost a whole year, the case stalled in place. The investigation gradually moved to passive mode since the police believed that all possible clues had already been checked. But on the 9th of April 2023, an unexpected turn occurred. Rangers checking local forests after winter accidentally stumbled upon a rusty metal cage standing in the middle of the forest. Inside were found toys, traces of human presence, and unclear inscriptions. That same evening, the police received a signal about a strange discovery in a ditch next to the highway. An exhausted boy who could barely speak uttered only one phrase: "I am Wilmer." He was alive, although no one had hoped to see him again. After this incident, the case was officially reclassified as aggravated kidnapping. A completely new stage of investigation was beginning, and the police understood. The main answer was still ahead. Almost a year had passed since the day when rangers found the cage in the forest, and the boy who introduced himself as Wilmer was discovered alive in the ditch. The police changed the course of investigation, reclassifying it as aggravated kidnapping. At this moment, a new, absolutely unexpected character emerges. The investigation finds on the blanket that lay inside the cage a foreign DNA trace clearly pointing to 34-year-old odd-job worker loner Anders M. Until this moment, he had not figured in any suspicions and had no connection with Wilmer's family. After discovering the DNA trace, the police quickly became interested in Anders. The first checks did not take long to wait, and to the investigators' surprise, gave encouraging results. Already after several days, they gained access to bank statements and records from surveillance cameras at gas stations. In May 2022, several days before Wilmer's disappearance, Anders M. made purchases that left no doubt about their strangeness. First, he acquired a strong metal bracket. At the pharmacy, bought sedative drugs intended for dogs, and at the hardware store, special anti-odor bags. The set of these purchases by itself looked quite alarming, and the investigation for the first time felt that they had found a real clue capable of leading them to an answer. However, Anders's motive remained completely unclear. He was alone, worked irregularly, and communicated little with those around him. But nothing from his past indicated a tendency toward crimes of such scale. All that the police had was strange receipts and video from cameras at gas stations recording his purchases. No explanations or motives had yet emerged. The police immediately called Anders M. for official questioning. His behavior was calm, almost detached. To the investigator's direct question about the purpose of acquiring the metal bracket, he answered in an even emotionless voice, "I was repairing a shed near the house. I needed reliable fixation for broken boards." Seemingly logical, and you cannot argue. But the police were not in a hurry to take his word for it and sent the item for examination. The expert group of police quite quickly came to an unexpected conclusion. The surface of the metal bracket had distinct traces of friction, characteristic of prolonged use as a handcuff or means of restricting human movement. This went against Anders's version. Now his words looked not just suspicious, but practically false. However, to direct accusations, Anders only calmly repeated, "I did nothing. I was fixing the barn." He did not deny the facts of the purchase themselves, only claimed that they were related to household needs. Throughout the entire interrogation, his calmness amazed even experienced police officers. It seemed that evidence against Anders was mounting with each hour. However, an unexpected witness appeared in the investigation who gave a completely different picture of events. Anders's neighbor, pensioner Gustav, claimed that on the day of Wilmer's disappearance, the 14th of May 2022, he saw Anders in a completely different city. Allegedly, Anders was helping him transport old furniture from his son's house, who lived 20 kilometers from Storfors. Police began checking this testimony, although from the very beginning there was a sense of inconsistency in it. First, the neighbor could not clearly remember the exact time of day when he allegedly saw Anders. Second, no confirming documents or receipts that would confirm Anders's trip to another city on the specified day were found. Nevertheless, the witness testimony created a crack in the accusation and gave Anders's lawyers grounds for defense. However, the confidence of the defense and police was again shaken when another unexpected episode appeared in the investigation. At one of the gas stations 5 kilometers from the place where Wilmer disappeared, a surveillance camera captured a quad bike belonging to Anders M., precisely on the day of the boy's disappearance. On the video recording frames, it was clearly visible how a person, presumably Anders, was refueling the equipment and buying water in the store at the station. This cast serious doubt on the neighbor's testimony, although it did not yet refute it completely. Thus, in one moment, the iron alibi that the defense side could have used to cover themselves hung by a thread. The situation became increasingly complicated. The investigation again found itself at a point where additional details urgently needed to be checked. Police quickly moved to the next stage of the investigation. There was a request for Anders's mobile phone billing to precisely establish his location on the day of Wilmer's disappearance. Simultaneously, an authorized search of the suspect's garage and house was being prepared. Investigators were certain that direct evidence of his involvement could be found precisely there. Meanwhile, Anders himself continued to maintain calm, as if not fully understanding the seriousness of the situation he found himself in. Perhaps it was precisely this cold-bloodedness that made investigators suspect him even more strongly, feeling that behind the external composure was hidden much more than what he revealed during interrogations. With each hour, the investigation delved deeper, but key answers to the main questions still remained ahead. While police carefully studied Anders Marc's movements and waited for the results of phone billing, investigators' attention was drawn to another important detail. In Wilmer's diary, there were entries that had not been given special attention before. The boy repeatedly wrote about strange voices in the forest and mentioned a desire to run away from home. This information made the investigation think about a completely different version of the incident: voluntary departure. The new information forced police to again turn to Wilmer's family. This time, detectives more thoroughly questioned the parents, especially the mother, who until this moment had actively cooperated with the investigation and seemed to be hiding nothing. However, now she reluctantly admitted that she had not informed police about regular visits from a family psychologist with whom Wilmer had been communicating for the last 6 months before his disappearance. The reason for the visits was sensitive. At Wilmer's school, bullying by older teenagers was being discussed. The family, fearing judgment and extra attention, preferred to keep silent about the psychologist consultations. This revelation by the mother immediately made police doubt the truthfulness and completeness of her previous testimony. The investigation immediately called the psychologist who had been working with Wilmer. He confirmed that the meetings were regular and the boy really was experiencing anxiety related to the behavior of older teenagers at school. According to the specialist, Wilmer was afraid of some older students and more than once mentioned in conversations a certain place in the forest, a hut where one can hide. The psychologist claimed that the boy repeatedly expressed a desire to leave home and hide precisely in this hut. The psychologist's words caused resonance, since they directly contradicted the version of forced abduction and made it clear that Wilmer could indeed have left of his own will, possibly under the influence of anxiety or fear of school persecution. Information from the psychologist instantly shifted police attention to another person: Wilmer's older cousin, a 16-year-old teenager named Victor. Earlier in the course of the investigation, his name had surfaced indirectly, but was not considered a serious lead. However, now, taking into account the psychologist's testimony, Victor suddenly found himself under suspicion. Police learned that Victor often boasted to friends that he knew special shelters in the forest. He said that someday he could hide there from parents or even from police. These were typical teenage conversations, but in the new circumstances they sounded alarming. However, during interrogation, Victor confidently stated that he did not know about Wilmer's whereabouts and only superficially discussed shelters with acquaintances. Checking his testimony and environment did not yield additional evidence, and police soon understood that they had again encountered a false direction. Meanwhile, operatives conducted an authorized search of Anders M's garage. The results were stunning. Among ordinary household junk and work tools, police found a small, old, slightly worn toy, a teddy bear. This was a twin of that very toy that had been found earlier in the forest cage where Wilmer was presumably held. Moreover, according to family testimony, neither brother Victor nor anyone from Wilmer's acquaintances had any access to this toy and could not have brought it to Anders. This find became a powerful signal, returning police attention back to the main suspect. The entire version of voluntary departure again wavered, and investigators understood that they again needed to return to the beginning and reconsider the entire chain of evidence. The next step of the investigation was obvious. Now investigators decided to compare the logistics of Anders's movements with the location of the cage in the forest. For this, they again raised video recordings from gas stations and checked whether the log of the suspect's quad bike coincided with paths of possible movement of the suspicious object into the forest area. Police calculated that precisely this technical comparison would become the key to the final solving of the case. Everything pointed to the soon solving of the main mystery. Although in the depths of the investigative group anxiety was growing, each new fact, each new find and witness testimony not only clarified but also complicated the overall picture of the case. Now investigators needed to make a choice of which version to trust more. Voluntary departure, carefully planned by the teenager, or cruel intervention by a stranger, whose motives remained hidden behind an impenetrable veil of uncertainties and unspoken things. The investigation was approaching its climax, although there was still a considerable path to travel before fully understanding the story and true motives. While investigators carefully compared Anders' mess routes with gas station video recordings and tried to figure out the story with the toy, the investigation received a new, unexpected turn. A veteran forester examining a long-abandoned sawmill 10 kilometers from the location where the cage was discovered accidentally stumbled upon a strange journal in which dates, liters of fuel, and suspiciously familiar numbers to the investigation were recorded. This discovery could completely change the picture of the case. Police experts quickly seized the journal and began comparing the records with receipts and video materials obtained from gas stations. It soon became clear that the dates and amounts of fuel indicated in the journal completely matched Anders's previously recorded visits to gas stations. But something else was more strange. Someone had neatly written incomprehensible notes in pencil in the margins of the journal, among which the abbreviation B2820 particularly stood out. The police quickly understood that this journal could not have appeared by chance, and that someone was clearly monitoring the progress of the investigation. The police decided to send the records for additional examination to decipher the mysterious code. After several days, experts presented two possible interpretations of the mysterious designation B2820. The first expert insisted that this was Anders M's personal equipment marking, the serial number of his ATV, which was spotted on video cameras. In such a case, the journal represented a direct indication that Anders consciously recorded his trips to the forest. This strengthened the suspicion that he was trying to carefully cover his tracks and control every action of his, remaining unnoticed by the police. The second expert, a specialist in criminal linguistics, proposed a completely different interpretation. According to his version, B2820 could be the number of a newspaper clipping or some archival designation indicating the source of information used by the journal's author. This hypothesis suggested the existence of some second person tracking or even influencing the course of the investigation. Each version sounded plausible, and investigators were forced to work through both hypotheses in parallel. The investigative team decided to check the second hypothesis and temporarily shifted attention to searching for the supposed second kidnapper. Suspicion immediately fell on former employees of the old sawmill where the journal was found. During the week, police methodically interrogated every worker who had ever been connected to this place. This was painstaking work. Many hours were spent checking alibis and studying the personal connections of each person questioned. However, it soon became clear that the investigation had reached a dead end. Most former employees had either moved away long ago or had not been in these places for several years at all. Thorough checking yielded not a single lead that could indicate anyone's involvement in the case. The version about a second kidnapper began to lose its relevance. Disappointed by the lack of progress regarding the second suspect, police returned to the journal. The investigation ordered additional, this time chemical expertise to check the ink with which the mysterious notes were made in the margins. The analysis results again confirmed the most unpleasant fears. The records were made with exactly the same marker that had previously been found in Anders M's garage. Now it became obvious. The hypothesis about a second kidnapper was merely a distracting maneuver, possibly an accidental coincidence. All traces led back to Anders again. Police understood that the mysterious records in the journal were another piece of evidence of his participation in the case, and attempts to confuse the investigation looked increasingly obvious and unsuccessful. The investigation reached a critical point. Having received exhaustive data on the ink and marker matches, the prosecutor's office was ready to take the next step. The prosecutor officially requested a warrant for Anders M's arrest. Immediately after this, forensic medical examination was to complete the analysis of Wilmer's condition to finally establish the details and nature of what happened to him. The investigation, which had seemed tangled and full of false directions, was gradually coming together into one single clear line of accusation. Details of the detention, motives, and other essential circumstances remained unknown to the general public, but the investigative team already clearly understood where all the facts and evidence were leading. Everything was approaching the finale. Although many questions still remained unresolved for those who observed the story from the sidelines. But it was precisely in these final days, when examinations and bureaucratic procedures reached their culmination, that it became obvious that soon there would be much fewer mysteries, and answers would be much clearer and more unambiguous. On the morning of the 15th of June 2023, the prosecutor's office finally received a warrant for Anders M's arrest. He was detained right at the doors of his own house. He offered no resistance, only quietly repeating that he was not guilty of anything. But soon all doubts of the investigation were finally dispelled. During an official interrogation, Wilmer, for the first time, clearly formulated what exactly had happened to him during the time of his disappearance. The boy briefly and dryly quoted Anders's words. He said he would make a friend out of me who would never leave. These simple words, devoid of emotion, became the final necessary link for the investigation. After Anders's arrest, investigators managed to assemble the final picture of the crime, combining previously scattered facts into one. The first and main detail: the cage in which Wilmer was held turned out not to be a stationary structure. The investigation established that Anders transported it every 2 to 3 weeks, carefully avoiding encounters with people. The cage was installed in different places in the deep forest area, which significantly complicated the search. A small generator and fan always worked near the cage. They masked any sounds, making accidental discovery practically impossible. Investigators could not understand for a long time why Wilmer did not try to give sound signals about his location. But the answer to this question was simple and cruel at the same time. Anders had taught the boy learned silence, using psychological pressure and control, forcing his captive to believe that any violation of the rules would end tragically. This is what explained the absolute silence surrounding the disappearance throughout the entire year. The gas station journal found at the sawmill turned out to be the most important piece of physical evidence, since Anders used it for careful logistics control. Every liter of fuel, every stop was recorded so as not to leave extra traces on regular receipts and bank statements. The numbers and dates matched perfectly with the refueling of the ATV, which he regularly used to move the cage. The examination of markers and ink finally confirmed Anders's authorship in keeping the journal and his notes in the margins. There were no doubts about other evidence either. DNA traces on the blanket from the cage, receipts for sedative drugs and odor-proof bags, surveillance camera video recordings. All this formed a continuous chain of evidence, leaving no doubt about his guilt. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, Anders suddenly changed his defense tactics. At the next interrogation, he unexpectedly broke down and began aggressively demanding a psychiatric examination, trying to prove his insanity. He even tried to tear up the interrogation protocol, but he was quickly subdued. This brief outburst of aggression did not impress the court. The appointed judicial psychiatric examination came to an unambiguous conclusion. Anders fully understood his actions and could answer for them before the law. Thus, his attempt to evade responsibility through psychiatry gave no result. On the contrary, the defendant's aggressive behavior only strengthened the court's confidence in the necessity of strict punishment. The trial took place in autumn 2023. In the presence of Wilmer's parents, investigators, and the public, Anders M. was sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment in a strict regime colony without the right to early release. The judge announced the verdict calmly and laconically, giving no assessments of motives and not trying to morally influence those present. He finished with words that echoed for a long time in the courtroom. The facts leave no doubt. The verdict is final and not subject to appeal. After the announcement of the verdict, the police carried out the dismantling of the cage, which for a year had been the central material evidence of the case. The last frame of the documentary filming was simple and cold. The camera slowly approached the rusty bars, behind which there would never be anyone again. No epilogue, no comments about the psychological state of the victim. Only emptiness, rust, and heavy, viscous silence. It was on this image, the cage that became a silent witness to one of the most mysterious and cruel crimes of recent years, that the story ended, leaving viewers alone with facts, dry documents, and the cold final point of the judicial verdict. On a clear day, a girl decided to ride her brand new bicycle to the local park and then unexpectedly disappeared without a trace. This incident immediately triggered a wide response among the residents of the small town, as similar events had already taken place in this area earlier. For 3 decades, people searched for answers, and only recently could light be shed on this profound mystery, which amazed all those who followed the developments. The results of the search were a true discovery, and led to many facts being re-evaluated. Jennifer Bastian was born on the 15th of April 1973 in Chicago. She grew up surrounded by the love and care of her parents and an older sister with whom she had a warm and friendly relationship. Later, the family moved to Tacoma, near Seattle. From a young age, Jennifer showed active participation and interest in various sports, including football and gymnastics, and strived to achieve outstanding results in each of these disciplines. She also possessed musical talent and often played piano. Her passion for athletic achievements always found the support of her parents. For one of her birthdays, her father gave her a special gift, a new bicycle. Jennifer immediately felt the desire to use it not only to ride through the city streets, but also to reach certain heights in cycling. When she learned about the upcoming magnificent bicycle race on San Juan Island, near the border with Canada, the young athlete decided to test her strength and registered to participate. She was aware that she would be dealing with real professionals of this sport, which spurred her to intensive training. During the holidays, she devoted her entire time to preparation and covered more than 10 kilometers daily on the bicycle. Her friend also expressed the desire to participate in the competition, so they became constant training partners. Since she lived near a large park where an approximately 8-kilometer circular route was laid out, this place became their main training arena. On a summer morning, the 4th of August 1986, Jennifer's day began at home in the company of her mother. After lunch, when her mother left for the evening shift, the girl planned to go to the park with her friend. But at the last moment, her friend's plans changed, and she could not come along. Nevertheless, Jennifer decided not to give up training, and after a conversation with her father, who gave his consent, she set off alone to the park. Before leaving, she left her mother a note, and around 2:30 in the afternoon she rode away from home, intending to return by the beginning of the evening. In the evening, shortly before 8:30, when the father came home, his daughter was not there, which completely surprised him. He thoroughly searched all the rooms and also looked outside, hoping to find her playing or riding her bicycle in the garage. But the girl was nowhere to be seen. Without hesitation, he contacted his wife, who immediately came home, and together they reported the incident to the police. The law enforcement officers immediately began searching for Jennifer by organizing a large-scale search operation in the park, which was extensive and mostly forested. The approaching darkness made the search more difficult and posed great challenges to the police officers and the volunteers who had come to help. By focusing on an 8-kilometer section of the road that Jennifer was assumed to have used, many volunteers from the community, known for their friendliness and willingness to help, joined the search. The police also conducted interviews among park visitors, asking anyone who might have seen the girl to come forward. Soon the first witnesses were found. 3 young people from her school who had seen her riding on the circular route around 14 o'clock. They also noticed a man on a bicycle near her and gave a description of him. Since the park was a popular recreation spot for Tacoma residents, where many people cycled and jogged, the police decided to be cautious with conclusions regarding this man's involvement in the girl's disappearance, and continued the careful search and investigation. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun was still high in the sky, 2 passers-by noticed Jennifer stopping at the roadside to take a sip of water. They briefly entered into conversation, during which the girl shared her hopes for success in the upcoming bicycle competitions. Despite all efforts, the search for Jennifer continued into the evening but remained fruitless. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, the police advised Jennifer's mother to stay at home in case her daughter should return on her own. They also brought search dogs, hoping to track down the girl using her personal belongings. The police officers and their dogs combed through the park until late into the night, but without success. Finally, it was decided to close the park for 3 days to continue the search undisturbed. With each day, more and more volunteers joined the police, which significantly increased the support and helpfulness of the local population. Jennifer's disappearance triggered unrest and serious concerns in the public, especially after an incident had occurred a few months earlier in a neighboring park that made many think about safety in their area. On a warm afternoon of the 26th of March, 5 months before Jennifer's disappearance, Michaela Welch and her younger sisters decided to spend the day in the park. They planned to go to music lessons afterward, but still had enough time. Michaela, who was always ready to take responsibility, called her mother at work and got permission for the outing. She always took care of her sisters while their mother worked. After receiving their mother's okay, the sisters cheerfully set off for the park. Michaela and one of her sisters preferred to ride bicycles, while the youngest rode on her skateboard. Arriving at the park, they realized they had forgotten snacks that could have strengthened them before music lessons. Michaela suggested quickly returning home to get food while her sisters should stay at the playground. The park was full of other children and their parents, so the older sister did not worry about their safety, as their home was only a few minutes away. While Michaela was on her way, her sisters decided to visit the cafe across from the park to use the restroom. When they returned, they found the food that Michaela had brought and her bicycle next to the table, but there was no trace of Michaela. They waited for a while, called for her, but she was nowhere to be found. Then the girls asked the adults present for help, and soon the police were called to find out what had happened. The police began a thorough investigation of the park area, hoping to find witnesses to the incident. They came across the story of a young man who claimed he had seen an unusual person under the bridge near the park, who was watching Michaela and her sisters. This youth gave the investigators an approximate description of the observer based on which a composite sketch was created. Another witness, an employee of the local school who happened to be driving by, claimed he had seen the girl in conversation with another man whose description did not match the first. This led to the conclusion that the witnesses might have seen different people. The search in the park continued into the deep night, and around midnight the police managed to discover important evidence in a remote part of the park, in a pit where a campfire was normally lit. Over time, medical professionals were able to determine details about DNA that possibly belonged to the perpetrator. However, since the events took place in the year 1986, the technologies were not yet advanced enough for a DNA database to exist. Furthermore, the specialists did not even have the possibility to adequately analyze the found DNA sample, which forced them to preserve the evidence for the future. Despite many tips from the population, none led to solving the incident. Sometime after the first incident, a person contacted the investigators who claimed to have seen someone who looked very similar to the person in the composite sketch, but already in a neighboring park. This gave law enforcement reason to suspect that the perpetrator might have changed his area of operation in search of a new opportunity. Shortly after this information became known, it was discovered that Jennifer had disappeared in the same park where the suspect was seen. There were striking similarities between the two cases. The girls were similar in age, were on bicycles in parks that were less than 6 kilometers apart from each other. The investigators, together with Jennifer's relatives, did not lose hope that this might merely be an unfortunate coincidence and that the girl would be found. But with each day, belief in a happy ending faded. The investigators were almost certain that Jennifer's case resembled that of Michaela and continued searching for her in the park. A few days later, Michaela's mother visited the house of Jennifer's parents to express her support and solidarity. This gesture was interpreted differently. Jennifer's mother refused to accept that something terrible could have happened to her daughter, and therefore did not see herself in a similar situation as Michaela's mother. Jennifer's family also sought public support, and even her sister urged everyone who could to participate in the search for Jennifer. These appeals triggered a wave of reactions among citizens. Many wanted to participate in the search actions, while others provided investigators with any information that could help with the investigation. Given the restless situation in the city, citizens' concern for the welfare of their loved ones grew significantly. Previously, many people did not hesitate to let their relatives go out on the street alone because the crime rate was relatively low. However, adults restrict the young people and do not even allow them to leave the house unsupervised for short periods. Each of their movements was constantly monitored to avoid any possibility of being alone on the street. Despite the zealous efforts of police officers and volunteers, the search for the missing girl brought no results in the following weeks. 24 days after her disappearance, Jennifer's mother decided to repaint the walls in her house to distract herself from worry. At exactly this moment, an investigator came with news that had to cause concern. In the park, not far from Jennifer's usual playground, objects were found that were connected to the incident. They were discovered by a passerby who was jogging in the morning, noticed an unusual scent, and immediately informed the police. The objects were hidden under a layer of branches and leaves between the trees. Experts suspected that the location was prepared by the perpetrator in advance, as this would have taken much time. A few meters away from there, the girl's bicycle was found, also carefully hidden with branches. According to the police assessment, the circumstances of the case were almost identical to the previous one, with the difference that this time no traces were found that could shed light on the identity of the perpetrator. After Jennifer was found, the police officers were more certain that they were dealing with the actions of a single criminal, although there was no concrete evidence and the value of DNA analyses at that time was minimal. The investigators put everything into finding this person, knowing that he could begin a new series of unlawful actions at any time, and tried to prevent possible incidents. They decided to check archives of similar cases and soon became aware of one case. In the year 1970, a girl disappeared, and 3 months later, objects were found in the forest area that were connected to her disappearance. A detailed investigation of this case led to David Fisher, a 29-year-old pet store employee whom the girl often visited because of her love for animals. He exploited her interest by telling her about soon-arriving monkeys that he was supposed to train. Fisher offered the girl to help him with this task, which she, unsuspecting, accepted. Fisher acted dishonestly and covered his tracks in the forest. After 3 years in custody, Fisher managed to be transferred to a facility with milder conditions due to his impeccable behavior, which resembled more of a farm where residents lived without strict restrictions. Through the absence of strict supervision, Fisher decided to leave this place since there were no barriers. Since his disappearance, law enforcement could not determine his whereabouts. Given the recent unpleasant incidents with Michaela and Jennifer, interest in Fisher increased since the circumstances were astonishingly similar. Psychologists who had worked with Fisher agreed that he might possibly return to his former behavior, but for 16 years, no trace of him was found, and investigators failed to find him. Many believed that Fisher had long since left the Tacoma area and would not dare to return for further acts. The investigations into these 2 cases came to a standstill. The police checked thousands of possible leads and many other persons for their involvement, but without success. Years later, when DNA analysis became routine, a review of samples in the databases took place, but no matches were found. Until the year 2011, there was no specialized department in the Tacoma Police Authority that dealt with unsolved cases. With the establishment of such a department, an experienced investigator was tasked with assembling a team. During the selection process, his gaze fell on Lindsay Wade, who had proven herself excellently over many years. She was invited to join the team for solving unsolved cases, and she agreed without hesitation. Lindsay shared that the stories about 2 peers, Jennifer and Michelle, had an enormous impact on her life, since she lived in the same area during her childhood and was their age. These events remained anchored in her memory forever, and were one of the reasons for her decision to enter police service. Her main task was to find out what had happened many years ago. 27 years after beginning her career, Lindsay took on these particularly important cases with full dedication and devoted all her time to working on them. Lindsay, who was always thorough in her investigations, left no place unconsidered that was connected to the case and studied all reports and evidence carefully. Her task was to create a list of all men who were even indirectly connected to the investigations. Finally, the list included everyone who was seen in the park on the day of the unpleasant incident, those who contacted the police with information, and even criminals who lived in the Tacoma area. This work lasted several months, and finally she stood before a list of 2,300 names. Finding the guilty person among so many people was not simple, however. Therefore, Lindsay decided to apply newer methods and sent the evidence again to the laboratory for analysis. In the 88th year, experts could only examine part of the evidence, since microscopic traces, for example on clothing, were beyond their capabilities, and DNA analysis was not yet practiced. But this time, the examination of Jennifer's clothing brought new DNA traces to light. When the specialists isolated the DNA pattern, an unexpected discovery awaited everyone. It did not match the previously known data for the Michaela case. This turn of events was a complete surprise for the investigators, who were convinced that the same person was responsible for all the incidents that had occurred. However, the evidence indicated the opposite. Before the team of investigators stood a difficult task. They were looking not just for one, but for 2 perpetrators. Initially, the case data was entered into the database, but there were no matches. Nevertheless, Lindsay did not give up and turned to Colin Fitzpatrick, a recognized expert in the field of genetic genealogy. She asked her to use her knowledge to support the case. Genetic genealogy makes it possible to identify a person through their DNA using extensive DNA databases through their family relationships. This discovery offers the possibility of finding even the most distant relatives and gradually narrowing the circle down to the DNA owner. theoretically, one could identify thousands of their relatives, whereupon each individual is carefully examined to find the right person. Colin provided a list of possible distant relatives, but this hardly helped the investigators further. After examining the proposed persons, the investigators could make no progress in apprehending the perpetrators. Unfortunately, the experts also failed to find closer relatives in the available databases. Furthermore, Lindsay turned to a company that specializes in creating approximate portraits of persons based on their genetic information. Although the results of their work could not guarantee complete accuracy, they often succeeded in creating images that actually resembled the sought persons. The portraits provided to the investigators were published to ask the public for help in identifying these persons. Many people responded to this, but unfortunately all the information received only led the investigators into dead ends. Thus, despite the application of the most modern technologies and methods of genetic genealogy, the task remained unattainable. Work on the case continued in the hope of finding the elusive perpetrators and achieving a breakthrough. After Lindsay carefully analyzed the list of 2,300 men, she decided to reduce it by excluding those who appeared as the least likely participants in the events. Eventually, she reduced the list to 160 names and thought about obtaining DNA samples from each of them. The task seemed extremely difficult, as 30 years had already passed since the events and many of these people had settled in various locations. A lengthy and monotonous work by the researchers began. Finally, they reached their goal, and each of the candidates voluntarily provided their samples. The next step was the analysis process, which proved to be lengthy due to the laboratory's workload with other cases, and it was impossible to check all 160 samples simultaneously. Lindsay sent the samples in small batches for analysis, which drew the process out over an entire year. In the year 2018, shortly before her retirement, she sent the last batch of 18 samples. The case was handed over to a new investigator who waited for the results. 25 days later, the new investigator contacted her to inform her that the DNA of one of the last 18 persons matched completely. The perpetrator was 60-year-old Robert Kern, whose name was known to Lindsay, as Robert was even mentioned in the reports before the incident with Jennifer. He had reported to the police about a person in the park who resembled the person from a phantom image in Michaela's case 2 months before the events with Jennifer, and exactly in this park an unpleasant incident later occurred. The investigators were surprised by this turn and did not understand why Robert provided information that turned out to be not entirely accurate. Despite the absence of a direct connection to Michaela's case, he directed the investigations to another park, where he later committed unlawful acts. Without his hint, he would never have appeared in the police reports, and no one would have asked him for DNA samples. It is interesting that Robert provided his biological data for verification on his own initiative, which ultimately helped to uncover his connection to the incident. He had never been in conflict with the law before this incident and had maintained an impeccable reputation since 1986. His home was located in the same district as Jennifer, and he was professionally employed at Boeing. Sometime after the incident, Robert started a family and a daughter was born who needed constant care due to her health needs. After the divorce from his wife, the daughter remained with him. The family moved to another state where Robert found no work and devoted himself completely to caring for the child. When the DNA analysis results matched, the investigators turned their attention to him and sent him to Washington, which was a complete surprise for everyone who knew him. Robert was always regarded as an impeccable father who devoted all his time to his daughter. Even his ex-wife noted that he never showed unusual behavior and was always extremely calm. However, his behavior changed noticeably during the interrogation. He became nervous. When it was not explained to him why he was arrested, he asked, "Is it because of the analysis I submitted a year ago? I have nothing to do with the incident." This statement was viewed by the investigators as an indirect indication of his involvement, although the evidence through the matching of DNA with traces found on Jennifer's clothing was already overwhelming. It was extremely difficult for Robert to find a defense during the trial, but his reaction to declare himself not guilty even before the announcement of the charges gave cause for thought. Despite all his efforts to prove the contrary, Robert ultimately accepted the offer to cooperate with law enforcement and admitted to being involved in the incident. He shared that at the time of the incident, he was on the same path. Robert also tried to express his regret to Jennifer's family. However, his words found no hearing among the relatives. As a result of the agreement in January 2019, he was imposed a sentence of 26 years and 6 months imprisonment with the possibility of early release after 20 years. Given Robert's age, the probability that he could return to a normal life seemed low. However, this did not mean the end of work for the investigators. For over 3 decades, they were convinced that the same person was behind the cases of Michaela and Jennifer. Despite the new circumstances, they were determined to continue their search for truth in Michaela's case, as these stories were connected for them and represented a common interest. In the year 2018, researchers again made contact with a company specializing in DNA analysis, this time with the request to use genetic genealogy to find the owner of a DNA sample. The technology had developed considerably over the years, and after months of intensive searching for relatives, the experts could narrow the search down to a family with 2 brothers. At the time of the incident, both brothers lived in the same house. The investigators' task was to obtain DNA samples from both men. For this purpose, they monitored each of them. The first was 66 years old, Gary Hartman. The surveillance revealed that he visited a hospital where he worked as a nurse, and then went to lunch with colleagues at a cafe. During the meal, he used a napkin, which the investigators secured immediately after his departure. This sample was immediately sent to the laboratory, and soon afterward, the investigators learned that Hartman's DNA matched the sample that had been found 32 years earlier. 40 days after Robert's arrest, Gary was also taken into custody, 32 years after the questionable actions. His arrest triggered a wave of surprise among friends and relatives, as Gary had never had problems with the law before. He led a quiet life with his 3rd wife and was known as a respected person. Despite the accusations, Gary refused to admit his involvement, and his case was referred to the court. The court trial began in the year 2022, and thanks to the evidence based on DNA analysis, a verdict on his guilt was quickly reached. At the moment of the verdict announcement, Gary could not hold back his emotions, screamed out and began to apologize to Michael's family. However, this changed nothing about his fate. He was sentenced to 26 years and 6 months imprisonment, similar to Robert. At this time, Gary was 70 years old, and during the trial, he needed the help of walking aids. Gary's lawyer emphasized that his client was not aware of the magnitude of his actions and for a long time was not able to comprehend his deeds. However, this was not seen by the court as a reason for mitigation of the verdict. Thus ended the investigation of 2 sensational cases that had been at the center of public attention for decades. Particularly disturbing was the fact that at the same time in the same area, 2 persons with similar behaviors existed, which amazed everyone who followed the events. Ultimately, both were held accountable, which restored faith in justice. In the year 2007, an incident occurred at one of the Portuguese vacation resorts that was later called the criminal mystery of the century. A 3-year-old English girl disappeared without a trace from her hotel room, which represented the beginning of the most expensive search operation in British history. Many theories and suspicions surrounded this case. It led to international debates and scandals, during which the parents of the missing girl were even received by Pope Benedict in the Vatican. In this video, we have compiled all available information to pursue the main question: what really happened to Madeleine McCann? In the year 2007, Kate and Jerry McCann chose a remote Portuguese vacation resort for their week-long holiday that was popular with Britons because one could easily communicate there in English with both locals and other vacationers. This place became known as Little Britain, which helped the family with 3 small children feel almost at home. The vacation resort offered access to 3 children's clubs and babysitting services, which was practical since the children's rooms were not open around the clock. Together with the McCanns, 4 other families spent their vacation there, consisting of 9 adults who all worked in the medical field and 8 children, including 2-year-old twins and their 3-year-old sister, Madeleine. The McCann family's days always followed the same routine: shared breakfasts and lunches in their apartments. Afterwards, the children played in the children's club while the adults spent their evenings in the restaurant and occasionally returned to the apartments to check on the children. One family, however, used a baby monitor to observe their children from a distance. Only 50 meters from their apartment lay the restaurant where they had reserved a table for the duration of their vacation, from which one had a view of the windows of their accommodation. Their bedroom, which faced the parking lot and garden side and had only one window with closed shutters on this side, was located next to the back door. At the other end of the room stood Madeleine's bed. The twins slept in a small crib while Madeleine lay in a separate bed with a soft pink plush cat, dressed in white pink pajamas with short sleeves. On the 3rd of May, about half an hour before 9 o'clock in the evening, Kate and Gerald went to the restaurant, leaving the sliding doors to the patio ajar but not locked. During dinner, they and their friends who were dining with them periodically checked on the children to ensure they were well. At 21:05, Jerry entered the children's bedroom and found that everything was quiet and Madeleine was sleeping peacefully in her little bed. However, he noticed that the door to the bedroom, which he remembered as being ajar, now stood wide open. Without attributing much significance to this, he adjusted the door and returned to the restaurant. Around 9:30, Kate planned to check on the children, but her friend Matthew Oldfield offered to do this while he checked on his own children in the neighboring apartment. Kate agreed. Oldfield found that it was quiet in the apartment and returned. Later, however, he admitted that he had not personally checked whether Madeleine was actually lying in her bed. At 10 o'clock in the evening, Kate went to see how her children were doing and entered the house through the glass doors to the terrace. She noticed that the door to the bedroom stood more open than usual. When Kate wanted to close it, the door fell shut easily due to the draft from an open window. In the room, the twins were sleeping quietly, and on Madeleine's bed lay her favorite stuffed animal. But Madeleine herself had disappeared. Unable to find her daughter in the apartment, Kate ran in panic to the restaurant and screamed that her daughter had been kidnapped. Friends of the McCanns who witnessed this moment remember that the parents were completely shocked. Madeleine's mother immediately began crying loudly and was as if paralyzed, while her husband seemingly perceived no one around him, searched the surroundings and looked for the child under parked cars. The search continued until 5 o'clock in the morning, and only after urgent advice did they agree to rest. At this point, the police had already searched their apartment. The Portuguese police initially made some serious mistakes. They informed border control about the disappearance only 24 hours after the beginning of the investigation, which significantly reduced the chances of catching the alleged kidnappers. Additionally, fingerprints were not taken immediately and the apartment was not sealed off, which led to the loss of important evidence. Only half an hour after reporting the disappearance, a large-scale search operation began with dozens of people, including resort staff and guests. They combed through the surrounding area hoping to find Madeleine, who might have gone for a walk looking for something interesting. With dawn, it became clear that something terrible had happened. The Portuguese police took up the investigation from all sides. They questioned not only employees of the local restaurant and friends of the McCann family, but also searched in the adjacent areas. In England, friends of the family had already informed the media about the girl's disappearance, hoping that this would spur the Portuguese officials to more effective measures. But this step only led to biased behavior by the police toward the parents, as they were convinced that too much media attention would hinder the investigation and reduce the chances of finding Madeleine. The situation worsened when the parents began publicly criticizing the police's actions, accusing them of inaction and lack of professionalism. 4 months after the girl's disappearance, the Portuguese police first put forward the theory that Kate and Jerry McCann, both doctors by profession, might have accidentally given their daughter an overdose of sleeping medication, hoping that she would sleep during their absence. It was assumed that the child did not survive the dose, and the parents, fearing the possible consequences, decided to hide the traces of a crime. They tried to convince everyone that Madeleine was kidnapped and then secretly hid the girl's body. Suspicions were reinforced by the behavior of 2 service dogs. One was trained to detect blood, the other to discover the smell of decomposition. The animals reacted exclusively in the McCann's apartment and in the car they had rented 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. Analysis of hair and tissue samples found in the car and in the apartment also indicated the possible presence of traces that interested the investigators. During further investigations, it turned out that the evidence, based on DNA analyses and the work of search dogs, was not reliable enough to accuse the parents in connection with their child's disappearance. This is because in about 70% of cases, dogs can misidentify the smell and the DNA analysis provided inaccurate results. Later, there were witness statements from people who saw a man carrying a girl in his arms that night. The investigators' attention turned to a 33-year-old Briton named Robert Murat, who lived only a few minutes' walk from the scene in his mother's house. He remained one of the main suspects for a time, but no evidence of his guilt was found. The situation changed when another tourist told that he also carried his daughter back to their room in his arms in the evening, which could have been falsely interpreted by witnesses as a kidnapping. Consequently, Robert Murat was acquitted and even managed to win a defamation lawsuit against British media. Despite the time that had passed, the parents of the missing girl did not give up and continued searching for her. They turned to a well-known PR agency in Britain and worked actively with it to maintain public interest in the case. Meetings with high-ranking personalities, including the US Attorney General and the Pope, participation in television shows, as well as the founding of the Madeleine Fund, into which £2 million sterling flowed in the first year, were part of their efforts. British investigators continued the examination of all possible evidence and questioned witnesses together with their Portuguese colleagues. Nevertheless, crucial evidence was still lacking, and in the year 2008, the Portuguese police decided to close the case. But in the year 2011, British Home Secretary Theresa May initiated a new investigation under the codename Operation Grange. At the center of the complex investigation, led by leading investigators from Britain, stood the mystery surrounding the presence of Madeleine McCann. Thanks to considerable financial resources, the team under the leadership of Andy Redwood, an experienced inspector, was able to question numerous witnesses both in Portugal and in England again. Redwood held onto the hope of being able to find Madeleine. During the course of the investigation, people were checked who had previously been convicted of legal violations, as well as the staff of local restaurants and vacationers at the resort. Nevertheless, none of the investigation directions led to success. Throughout the entire investigation, helpful citizens from around the world, including the United States, Britain, Switzerland, Mexico, and Singapore, sent over 8,000 messages with claims about possible whereabouts of Madeleine. Despite examining more than 100 potential leads, the investigators could not confirm any of them, as most information was either secret or proved to be unconfirmed. Gonçalo Amaral, who led the original investigation into Madeleine McCann's presence according to the Portuguese police's portrayal, defended for a long time the theory that her relatives were responsible for the event, despite repeated denials from Scotland Yard. In July 2008, Amaral published a book and a documentary titled The Truth About the Lie, in which he laid out his conviction that the McCann family had invented Madeleine's presence to hide their legal violation. Amaral described his work as based on official evidence, while Madeleine's family criticized it as absurd and full of lies. Nevertheless, the book became very successful in Portugal, became a bestseller, and brought the author and publisher an estimated more than $1 million. Amaral actively gave interviews on various television channels, continued his statements against the parents regarding their involvement in Madeleine's presence, and claimed that the girl was still somewhere in Praia da Luz. At a certain point, the theory was put forward that Madeleine had gone on behalf of a wealthy family, but this hypothesis was considered unlikely by the investigators. Madeleine's presence occurred only 9 days before her birthday, at an age when people already have a strong bond with their family, and it is unlikely that they would easily accept someone strange as new relatives. In the case of the disappearance, there was a theory that she unintentionally disrupted the plans of lawbreakers. According to this view, the criminals broke into her room, but Madeleine woke up, saw them, and they decided to eliminate the risk of discovery. But are there doubts about this theory? If they were only concerned about getting rid of a witness, it is unclear why they should take her with them. It also seems unlikely that she could recognize their faces in the darkness. Danny Collins, a British journalist, believes that she left the room herself to search for her family and then encountered unforeseen visitors. He refers to the window shutters, which were closed and could only be opened from the inside, excluding external influence. The absence of break-in traces on both the windows and the door supports his view. Collins put forward a theory according to which unauthorized access to the apartment would be unlikely. The McCanns disagreed with this and claimed that she could not have gone outside alone, as she would have to overcome several obstacles: the entrance door, sliding doors, and secured protective barriers, and she would also have to close them behind her. A journalist, however, contradicted and pointed to the couple's ignorance regarding the apartment's window shutters, which cannot be opened from outside. First, the couple said that the window shutters were pulled up. This allows for the possibility that Madeleine left the house independently and was involved in an accident. Near the McCann's apartment, at a distance of 180 meters, roadwork was taking place, during which a safe depression with a depth of 188 centimeters and a width of 120 centimeters was excavated, into which she could have accidentally fallen. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the next day work was carried out with heavy equipment and Madeleine could have been overlooked. The leader of the work group, however, refuted this theory and explained that the examined depressions were carefully checked by his employees and the police. At the center of the investigations into Madeleine McCann's disappearance was once Clement Freud, a British politician and writer, direct descendant of the famous Sigmund Freud. Freud knew the McCann family and owned property in Praia Dallas. However, he died in 2009, and only 7 years after his death did several women raise accusations against him. However, evidence for his involvement in Madeleine's disappearance was not found, and this theory was rejected. By the year 2015, the number of investigators working on the case had reduced from 28 to 4. By the year 2015, the British government had spent more than $19 million on the search, which provoked feedback because of the enormous expenses while prospects were simultaneously dwindling. Many thought there was no longer any expectation of finding answers. But history has shown that fate can take unexpected changes. In the year 2012, the investigation attracted not only the attention of Portuguese and English investigators, but also of the Germans. It was precisely these who brought forward a serious accusation after 13 years since the mysterious disappearance. They claimed to have found a probable suspect. Initially, the identity of this person was kept secret in order not to endanger further investigations. But by summer 2020, the German police shared details. The main suspect was Christian Bruckner, a German who was already previously convicted for similar acts. At the same time, the investigators expressed the grim assumption that Madeleine probably can no longer be found. One day before Madeleine's disappearance in May 2007, Bruckner informed one of his ex-girlfriends that he had planned work in Praia da Luz for the next day. He described it as dishonest, but necessary. 3 years after this event, another acquaintance noticed a similarity between a photo of Bruckner and the phantom sketch of the alleged suspect, even made jokes about it. However, Bruckner did not respond seriously, only shrugged his shoulders. The prosecutor of Pfalz, Hans Christian Wolters, emphasized that the investigations found new information. The suspect had discussed his intentions on the internet and had also left other traces of his activities there. Wolters is convinced that Bruckner is responsible for this act and suspects that it might not have been his only such act. When Bruckner was declared the main suspect, he was already in custody in Portugal because of an act against a 72-year-old woman from the USA. German investigators are searching for Madeleine, who cannot be found. They are examining a possible connection between Bruckner and this case. During the investigations, 2 properties belonging to the suspect were thoroughly examined. Sensational discoveries were made in the process. On one of the properties, a secret room was found, which the media quickly reported about and designated as a secret room. The exact details of what was found are not disclosed, but the police consider this find to be important evidence. On the other property, a box with videocassettes was found whose content also remains secret. Bruckner showed no reaction to the accusations in the Madeleine case. After his name became public, he was immediately placed in a personal cell to protect him from other prisoners. There is the possibility that he will make a statement, which could alleviate the misfortune of the family that has been searching for answers for 14 years, even without direct evidence against him. A large part of the investigation team is convinced of his responsibility in Madeleine's disappearance, which again awakened public interest in the old case. This could contribute to a resumption of support for the search, especially if Madeleine is still alive. On the 12th of May 2021, Madeleine should have celebrated her birthday. Her parents continue to hope for her arrival and buy gifts for every celebration, hoping that they will one day be together again, although they have recently been paying more attention to the rest of the family.